Hi everyone, this is a video on recombinant DNA technology. Though the primary aim of this presentation is to let you know the various processes, tools and applications of this particular technique, my actual aim is to enable you to get answers for the various questions that are in your mind related to the recent vaccines, including Covishield, Sputnik and the one which is yet to be released, which is Covivax. And as a medical professional, I'm sure you'll be able to relate to me if I say these days, the moment we introduce ourselves as a medico, we get bombarded with various questions, starting with SARS-CoV-2, and then they ask us about COVID-19, and they also ask us about vaccines. Right? For example, last week I met my uncle who asked me about Covishield. So I told him that it's nothing but injecting nucleic acid into a person. And he was astonished. And the next question from him was, okay, you're injecting a viral nucleic acid into a human being. What if that exogenous nucleic acid interferes with human gene expression? And what if the human starts growing tail like his or her ancestors? It's not a joke, it's a true factual thing which happened. So I feel it's our responsibility, any medico's responsibility, to tell them an answer for such questions with a conviction that we are able to pull in many vaccinators, right? Many should get vaccinated for this new normal to rest and for us to get back to what we were previously. So I'm very sure you'll be able to answer such questions with a conviction, provided you watch this video till the end. So if you're visiting my YouTube channel for the first time, I am Dr. Shanmugapriya, Professor and Head of the Department of Biochemistry at Government Thoothukudi Medical College. I have released an app for biochemistry under the title Basics to Clinics. And the main aim of this app is to let you know or let you see the unseen side of biochemistry. I want you to know that biochemistry has got another side which is interesting, which is enchanting, and that's clinical biochemistry. So if you're interested in learning clinical biochemistry, I have attached the link for subscription to my app in the description box below. Kindly use it. Now let's quickly get on to this topic, recombinant DNA technology. And for this presentation, I've got few objectives to be met. First, I'm planning to tell you about cloning. I'll tell you what is cloning, and then I'll tell you about the two types of cloning. And one of the types of cloning being cell-based cloning or recombinant DNA technology. I will tell you in detail about the processes involved in recombinant DNA technology. Then I'll tell you about the three tools that are essential for this technique. First tool is restriction endonucleases. The second one is hybridization technique or blotting technique. And the third one is the vector. And I want you to understand that in almost every process, every recombinant DNA technology that we are trying to apply, we try to produce protein on a large scale. Or in other words, we are trying to let the genome express. So there is something called as expression vector and their qualities. That will be discussed next. I'll be telling you what are the basic qualities an expression vector should have. And finally, the interesting aspect would be applications of recombinant DNA technology. And when we discuss applications, I'm planning to tell you about all these viral vaccines. Okay, so let's first discuss what is cloning. Cloning is nothing but production of identical copies. We know that, right? Cloning is production of identical copies. And here we are trying to produce identical copies of DNA. Or in other words, we are trying to replicate a specific DNA multiple times. And for replication, there are few requirements. Starting with the enzyme which replicates. The enzyme which replicates, as we all know, is DNA polymerase. And then requirements of DNA polymerases, starting with a primer. DNA polymerase does not elongate a DNA strand out of thin air. It needs a primer to elongate a strand. So the next requirement would be a primer. And then we need all 4 deoxynucleotide triphosphates, because DNAs and RNAs are polymers of nucleotide triphosphates. The next one would be deoxynucleotide triphosphates. And then we need magnesium or manganese or any divalent cation to act as a catalyst. and finally a buffer to maintain the pH of this chemical reaction. Please remember, though cloning sounds something which is sophisticated, it's actually a chemical process, and for any chemical process we need a buffer to maintain the pH. So we need a buffer. So these are the requirements of cloning. Now for a supply of all these requirements, if you are dependent on a whole living cell like E. coli, then that's called as cell-based cloning. To make it simple, if you are taking the DNA which you are trying to amplify, and if you are inserting that DNA into a cell like E. coli, and if E. coli takes care of the replication process, then that's called as cell-based cloning, which is nothing but recombinant DNA technology. Now what is on the other side? On the other side, we take a small test tube, and into this test tube we add all the requirements of replication one after another, and we allow the replication to happen in vitro. Then that's called as in vitro cloning or enzyme based cloning, and that is polymerase chain reaction. So cloning is of two types. One is cell based cloning, the other one is enzyme based cloning. Cell-based cloning is nothing but the recombinant DNA technology about which we are trying to discuss now, and enzyme-based cloning is nothing but polymerase chain reaction. Now I am going to tell you the various steps involved in recombinant DNA technology, imagining that we are trying to produce insulin on a large scale. Yeah, so an example is we are trying to produce insulin on a large scale. To produce insulin, the first raw material that we want is insulin gene, right? Because only when you have multiple copies of insulin gene, you can get multiple copies of insulin mRNA, and then we get multitudes of insulin protein. From where do we plan on getting that insulin gene? Yeah, insulin gene is present in human chromosome. So the first step of recombinant DNA technology is you take human chromosome, and you cleave this human chromosome into multiple fragments using a DNA scissor called as restriction endonuclease. So what is the first tool that is necessary for recombinant DNA technology? It is restriction endonuclease. And if your question is why am I cutting human chromosome, it is because after I cut human chromosome into multiple fragments, I am going to identify that fragment which has got the gene of interest, and I am going to amplify only that fragment. Yeah, that's optimal utilization of resources, optimal utilization of time. Yeah, instead if I am going to amplify the whole human chromosome, it's a waste of time and waste of resources. So the first tool that is necessary is a DNA scissor called as restriction endonuclease, using which we have got multiple fragments of human chromosome. Now in the next step, I am going to identify one particular fragment which has got the gene of interest, and that is done by hybridization technique or blotting technique. So what is the next tool that is necessary for recombinant DNA technology? It is hybridization technique or blotting technique, about which I will be discussing in a short while. That's the second tool. So let's just assume that using that technique we have identified that this is the fragment with gene of interest. The next step is we are going to attach this fragment to a vector. So what is the role a vector does? Vector is a vehicle, and it carries the fragment with gene of interest, and it's going to get into E. coli. So what is the third tool that is necessary for recombinant DNA technology? It is vector. And do you see here that you are linked to unrelated genome, right? One is a vector which is prokaryotic, the other one is fragment with gene of interest which is eukaryotic, and that is why the product is called as recombinant vector, and that's why the technique is called as recombinant DNA technology. Now we have formed a recombinant vector, and now comes the difficult step of recombinant DNA technology, where we are trying to introduce this recombinant vector into a living cell like E. coli. And because this is the most difficult step, it's considered as a rate limiting step of recombinant DNA technology, because ultimately the efficiency of this technique will depend upon how effectively you have introduced recombinant vector into E. coli. Yeah, ultimately whether you get thousands of products or just 10 products would depend upon how efficient you have introduced the recombinant vector into E. coli. So this is the rate limiting step of recombinant DNA technology. So generally what we do is using high electric currents. Yeah, using high electric currents, we introduce pores onto the cell wall, and through these pores recombinant vector will be taken up. So this step is called as electroporation step. Yeah, this step is called as electroporation step, the rate limiting step of recombinant DNA technology. And once you're done with this step, the rest E. coli takes care, because whenever the vector replicates, you get multiple copies. Whenever the cell divides also, you get multiple copies. So this is an outline of recombinant DNA technology processes. So what are the three tools that we want? The first one is restriction endonuclease, second one is hybridization technique, and the third one is vector. Let's discuss about these three tools one by one. First, about restriction endonucleases. They are called as restriction endonucleases because these are enzymes that are produced by bacteria, and these enzymes limit entry of exogenous nucleic acids by cutting them. Okay, and these restriction endonucleases cut at specific sites, and those sites are palindromic sequences. Now, what is a palindrome in literature? In literature, palindrome is a word or a phrase which has the same meaning when read from either side. Yeah, for example, rotor, R-O-T-O-R, will have the same meaning when you read it from either side. That's palindrome normally in literature. Now, what is a palindromic sequence? Palindromic sequence is a double-stranded sequence. Yeah, it's a double-stranded sequence wherein as the 3' 5' strand sequence, you have the 5' 3' strand sequence read in the reverse direction. Yeah, it's a double-stranded sequence wherein as the 3' 5' strand sequence, you have the 5' 3' strand sequence read in the reverse direction. I'll give you an example. Suppose 5' 3' strand sequence is GGATCC. And I'm asking you to write complementary sequences for this. Okay, so what is complementary to G? So it becomes CCTAGG. And don't you see that the 3' 5' strand sequence is nothing but the 5' 3' strand sequence read in the reverse direction. So this is a palindromic sequence, and only palindromic sequences are cut by restriction endonucleases. And depending upon how an enzyme cuts a palindromic sequence, these enzymes are of two types. One is a sticky end producing restriction endonuclease. The other one is a blunt end producing restriction endonuclease. Now, what is a sticky end producing restriction endonuclease? Here the enzyme cuts both the strands at two different sites. Instead of cutting both the strands after the first nucleotide or after the second or after the third, in this type, the enzyme cuts both the strands at two different sites like this. It cuts the top strand after the first nucleotide, bottom strand after the fifth nucleotide. And this is called as a sticky end producing restriction endonuclease because the cut ends produced are staggered. This will be one end, and this becomes the other end. So the cut ends produced are staggered, and that is why you call it as a sticky end producing restriction endonuclease, because using this enzyme you would have cut not only human chromosome, you would have also cut the vector. Why do you have to cut the vector? Only when you cut the vector you can introduce the fragment with gene of interest. And suppose this represents the fragment with gene of interest, and suppose this represents the end of a vector. The moment you bring the vector and the fragment with gene of interest, because they have hanging edges, they link together, they form hydrogen bonds. So forming recombinant vector is easier. Yeah, forming recombinant vector is easier if it's a sticky end producing restriction endonuclease. So what is a blunt end producing restriction endonuclease? Here the enzyme cuts both the strands at the same point, after the first or after the second or after the third, like this, so that the cut ends produce a blunt. So you call it as a blunt end producing restriction endonuclease. So obviously the difficulty here is Even if you bring the vector and the fragment with gene of interest, because there are no hanging edges, they don't link together. So you will end up using very strong DNA ligases to ligate them. And very few blunt end producing restriction endonucleases are still in use. One example is HPA1. Even ALU1 is a blunt end producing restriction endonuclease. Okay, so that's all about the first tool that is necessary for recombinant DNA technology, which is restriction endonucleases. Now the second tool is hybridization technique. What are we going to use this hybridization technique for? To identify the fragment with gene of interest. Yeah, for this, the first step is, after you have multiple fragments, all these fragments are separated based on length by electrophoresis. Yeah, you must have seen electrophoretic separation. So what I am drawing here is a gel, and these are all wells. And into one well you have put all fragments which you have obtained by cutting the human chromosome. And I am going to connect this gel to an electrical supply in such a way that close to the point of application is connected to negatively charged electrode. The opposite side is connected to positively charged electrode. When I switch on the electric current, because all these DNA fragments are negatively charged, they start moving towards positively charged electrode. And the migration gets affected by the length. Longer fragments cannot move faster, so they stay close to the point of application, and shorter fragments migrate. So what is the first step of hybridization technique or blotting technique? It is electrophoretic separation of fragments. Yeah, electrophoretic separation of fragments based on length. The next step is, I am going to denature all the fragments. Why am I denaturing all the fragments? Because all these fragments are double stranded, and in due course I am going to use a probe to find out the fragment with gene of interest, and for that probe is single stranded. And for the single stranded probe to hybridize, these fragments should be again single stranded. Do you understand this? So after electrophoretic separation, the next step is denaturing all the fragments so that they become single stranded. After denaturation, the next step is, I take this gel and I blot it on a nitrocellulose paper, because handling a gel is very difficult. Even if you touch the gel would break. So for hybridization technique facilitation, after denaturation, I take the gel and I blot the gel on a nitrocellulose paper, so that all these bands get transferred to the paper, and that's why it's called as blotting technique or hybridization technique. So after blotting, I take that paper and I dip the paper in a solution containing radio labeled probe. You all must have seen a petri dish. So I take the petri dish, I fill the petri dish with a solution containing radio labeled probe, and into that solution I drop this paper. So this is how the paper exists in the petri dish, and on this paper we have all these bands. And I said this petri dish is filled with a solution containing radio label probes. So these radio label probes will try to find complementary sequences here, and if they find complementary sequences, they hybridize. Suppose they find complementary sequence in the third band, they go and hybridize here. So this step is called as hybridization step, because you are giving time for the probe to hybridize with the fragment with gene of interest. And after you give enough time for hybridization, you take out the paper, you wash away excess unbound probe. So the next step is a washing step. And after you wash away excess unbound probe, you expose the paper onto an X-ray. And because these probes are radio labeled, they form a marking on X-ray, and that's called as autoradiogram. Yeah, that's called as autoradiogram. And by visualizing the autoradiogram, I will know which fragment has got the gene of interest. Okay, so have a look at this picture. The first step in hybridization technique or blotting technique is electrophoretic separation of all these fragments based on length. Next step is I denature all these fragments on the gel. Third step, I take the gel and I blot it on a nitrocellulose paper. Then I dip this nitrocellulose paper in a solution containing radio-labeled probe. So these radio-labeled probes will try to find complementary sequences. Once they find, they hybridize. After you give enough time for hybridization, you expose the paper onto an X-ray. And because it's radio-labeled, it forms a marking on the X-ray that's called as autoradiogram. And this technique is called as Southern hybridization or Southern blotting, named after the person who invented this technique. So if you're using this principle for identifying unknown DNA fragment like what I've discussed so far, it's called as Southern blotting or Southern hybridization. If you're using the same principle but you're trying to identify an unknown RNA fragment, then that's called as Northern blot. You're using the same principle but for identifying an unknown protein, that's called as Western blot. If you want to know process wise what is the difference between Southern, Northern and Western blot, you kindly check my app. Yeah, but for now this is how they are named. For identifying DNA it is Southern blot, for identifying RNA it's Northern blot, for identifying protein it is Western blot. So with this we have identified which fragment has got the gene of interest. What is the next step? We are going to attach that fragment with gene of interest to a vector. So the third tool that you want for recombinant DNA technology is a vector. Now what are the qualities a vector should exhibit? You cannot randomly take an oligonucleotide, or you cannot randomly take a polynucleotide, you cannot ask it to act as a vector. There are few qualities a vector should exhibit. The first quality is they should be capable of self-replication. Yeah, because what ultimately are we trying to achieve by recombinant DNA technology? We are trying to produce protein on a large scale. That's possible only when the vector is not a passive vehicle just carrying the fragment with gene of interest. It should actively take part in replication process. So the first quality a vector should exhibit is that it should be capable of self-replication. But please have this in mind, this is not mandatory for all vectors. Yeah, if a vector is going to be responsible for producing a protein in vivo within human body, for example Covishield, right? So what is Covishield concerned with? So in Covishield, we attach a fragment of the viral genome which is capable of producing a protein of the virus, and that protein is produced within the human body, right? In that case, if you're going to allow the vector to be capable of replication, the vector replicates inside the human body, causing possibly a disease. Yeah. So all that the vector in this case is supposed to do is the vector should carry the fragment with gene of interest. It should get into human cell, and within human cell the human transcription machinery, the human translation machinery is going to produce the protein in multitudes. Okay, in that case the virus should not be capable of replication. So generally if it's in vitro replication, or if it's like ex vivo is outside human body happening in tissue culture. So if it's ex vivo production of a protein, the virus should be capable of self-replication. But if it's in vivo production of the protein, the virus should not replicate. It should be replication deficient virus. Okay, so that's about the first property of a vector. The second property is it should have the restriction site of the enzyme that has been chosen for this technique. So first, how do you choose the restriction enzyme? It's a simple logic. You choose restriction enzyme in such a way that it does not cut the gene of interest. What would happen if you choose a restriction enzyme which cuts right in the middle of, say, insulin gene? Yeah, insulin protein will not be produced. So you choose restriction enzyme in such a way that it does not cut the gene of interest. Having found out a restriction enzyme or having picked up a restriction enzyme, you choose a vector in such a way that it has got that particular restriction site. So we have many softwares which are available to find out if the vector which you choose has got the particular restriction site. We have NEB cutter. So there are many softwares that can be used. So it should have the restriction site of the enzyme that is chosen for this technique. Third is it should have one or more marker genes for identification. What are we trying to identify here? As I told you initially, formation of recombinant vector is not that easy because we are trying to link two unrelated genome. One is prokaryotic vector, the other one is eukaryotic gene fragment. So formation of recombinant vector is not that easy. And even if you have formed a recombinant vector, introducing the recombinant vector into E. coli or any other yeast is again difficult. So after you make an attempt to introduce the recombinant vector into a cell, you need a means, you need a way to identify those colonies which have taken up the recombinant vector, and you should allow only those E. coli colonies to grow. Otherwise, the rest of the colonies will overgrow this, because though we think of recombinant DNA technology as something which is sophisticated, ultimately recombinant DNA technology happens in a small petri dish, right? And in a petri dish, E. coli colonies compete with each other. So after you make an attempt to introduce a recombinant vector into E. coli, there should be a way of you identifying those E. coli colonies which have taken up the recombinant vector, right? And that is possible only when these vectors have marker genes. And if it's a natural vector which you choose natural vectors in such a way that they have at least two resistance genes, like ampicillin resistance gene and tetracycline resistance gene. Okay, so these are the three properties a vector should exhibit. They should be capable of self-replication, they should have a restriction site, and they should have marker genes. Now, based on the length of the genome to be amplified, we have choices of vectors. If the length of the genome to be amplified is between 5 and 15 kilobase pairs, we can use plasmid as a vector. Yeah, between 5 and 15, we can use plasmid as a vector. Between 40 and 50 kilobase pairs, we can use phage DNA. If it's more than 100 to 300 kilobase pairs, we can use bacterial artificial chromosome. More than 300 kilobase pairs, no other go, we have to utilize yeast artificial chromosome. So based on the length of the genome to be amplified, we have choices of vectors. First, about plasmids. You know, plasmids are small circular extra chromosomal DNA. Yeah, plasmids are small circular extra chromosomal DNA, and both their advantage and disadvantage lie in the fact that they are small. Why is it advantageous if they are small? If they are small, introducing recombinant vector into cell is easier. Yeah, if it's a plasmid vector, please remember we don't use a sophisticated electroporation step. All that we do is we form a recombinant vector, we add recombinant vector in a plate containing calcium, and then we suddenly freeze it. Yeah, that heat shock plus calcium in the medium is just enough for the recombinant vector of plasmid to get into E. coli. That's why it's advantageous to use a smaller vector. Why is it disadvantageous if you use a smaller vector? As I told you, if the length of the genome is more than 15 kilobase pairs, we cannot use plasmid as a vector. Yeah, that's about plasmid being used as a vector. Now about phage DNA, it's very simple. Phage is a virus which infects a bacteria. And in phage DNA, luckily 1/3 of the DNA is non-essential. It is not necessary for package, it's not necessary for replication. So that non-essential region alone can be cut and removed, and it can be replaced with a fragment with gene of interest. And another advantage of using a phage DNA is you don't have to worry about introducing the genome into the bacteria. Bacteriophage by itself is blessed with that property of introducing its genome into E. coli, right? So that's about using a phage DNA. So this is the non-essential region which can be replaced with a fragment with gene of interest. And about artificial chromosomes, both bacterial artificial chromosomes and yeast artificial chromosomes, advantage of using artificial vectors is that it is something which we are going to synthesize. So you can introduce any quality which you want. Yeah, you can introduce as many origins of replication as you want. You can introduce any restriction site you want. You will introduce a marker gene which is easy for identification. Yeah, you can introduce a marker gene which is easy for identification. And the most commonly used marker gene in all artificial vectors is beta galactosidase gene. Yeah, the most commonly used marker gene in all artificial vectors is beta galactosidase gene, and that is shown here. This dark blue represents beta galactosidase gene. As you can see here, it is cut to introduce the fragment with gene of interest, which means the recombinant vector does not have beta galactosidase gene. You understand this? The recombinant vector does not have beta galactosidase gene. So after you make an attempt to introduce this recombinant vector into E. coli, you allow this E. coli to grow in a plate in which you have added a substrate for beta galactosidase, which will give blue color. Do you understand this? You allow E. coli to grow in a plate into which you have added a substrate for beta galactosidase, which will give blue color. So if you see blue color colonies, it means beta galactosidase is intact. It means it does not have the fragment with gene of interest. So this is not what you want. If you see white colony, it means beta galactosidase has been cut and the fragment with gene of interest has been introduced. That is why it is white, and that's why that is what you want. So this is the basis of blue and white technique. Yeah, this is the base of blue and white technique used for identifying E. coli colonies with recombinant vector, and the marker gene that is used for this purpose is beta galactosidase gene. White color colonies represent those colonies which have taken up the recombinant vector. Okay, so that's about bacterial artificial chromosome. Now about yeast artificial chromosome. When the length of the genome to be amplified is more than 300 kilobase pairs, we need yeast artificial chromosome. Not just that, if it's a protein which needs to undergo extensive post-translational modifications, yeah, that's possible only in the case of an eukaryote. So we end up using yeast artificial chromosome. So that's the advantage of using yeast, because it follows qualities of eukaryotes. So if it's a protein which needs to undergo extensive post-translational modification or extensive post-transcriptional modification, then we utilize yeast artificial chromosome. Okay, that's all about vectors. That's all about the 3 tools that are necessary for recombinant DNA technology. Starting with restriction endonucleases, we discussed about hybridization technique or blotting technique, and then we also discussed about vectors. Now, what are expression vectors? So all that we have discussed so far is only about amplification. It's only about replication. But when you want proteins to be produced, just producing copies won't be enough. Those copies should be capable of expressing themselves as proteins. They should be capable of undergoing transcription. They should be capable of undergoing translation. So the vector which you choose should have promoters, operators and terminators for transcription. Yeah, the qualities of an expression vectors are they should have promoters, operators and terminator sequences for expressing the gene as mRNA. And most commonly used promoter sequences lack operon. Yeah, because it is inducible. So if you are a medical student, you know you get questioned about lac operon often, right? I mean, you might be wondering why am I asked about lac operon, which is a prokaryotic characteristic. It's only because it has got an application. The most commonly used promoter is a lac operon because it's inducible in the presence of allolactose and in the presence of IPTG. So you can increase the expression of these genes if you insert lac operon. And then there should be an initiation codon, right? All these will help in transcription. And then for translation, there should be initiation codon and a stop codon. And initiation codon, you know, in prokaryotes will be expressed within Shine-Dalgarno sequence. In eukaryotes, it will be expressed within Kozak consensus sequence. All these are explained in detail in my app when we discuss about transcription and translation. And apart from this, because we are worried about producing a protein and then purifying the protein that is expressed should be soluble enough. And to add solubility, we add more sequences, like we add mannose binding protein sequences. After initiation codon is present, there will be mannose binding protein sequences which will enable the protein that is synthesized to be more soluble. And then if it's an immune response related protein, we see to it that we do something to increase the immunogenicity. Yeah, for example, in Covishield, in Covishield vaccine, what we have done is we have added sequences of tissue plasminogen activator, because we know tissue plasminogen activator protein has got a leader sequence which will allow the protein to be secreted out of the cell. And in the case of Covishield, we want the S protein to come out of the cell, only then B cells and T cells will get activated. That is why what we have done is, we have not only included promoter sequences or operator or terminator sequences, we have not only included initiation codon and stop codon. Additionally, we have included tissue plasminogen activator leader sequence to increase immunogenicity, because only in the presence of these leader sequences, S protein would come out of the cell, will adhere to the cell membrane so that it gets exposed to B cell, causing antibody release. So these are the qualities of an expression vector. Now I have a very simple and interesting question based on whatever we have learned about recombinant DNA technology. What do you think about this? Do you think human genes can be cloned and expressed in E. coli? Is it an yes or a no? Can human genes be cloned and expressed in E. coli? It's partly yes and partly no. So human genes can be cloned in E. coli. You can produce multiple copies of human genes in E. coli, but it cannot be expressed in E. coli. Reason is, human genes are known for intronic sequences. They are known for multiple non-coding intervening sequences. So when you introduce such human genes with introns into E. coli will multiply, it will produce multiple copies. But when the question of expression comes, E. coli can produce only something which is analogous to a primary transcript. E. coli does not have splicing machinery. It cannot convert the primary transcript into functional mRNA. Okay, so it cannot be expressed. So how do you think we have overcome that difficulty? Only because we have overcome that difficulty, we are able to produce insulin on a large scale, right? So what are we supposed to do? We are supposed to take human genes, we are supposed to remove introns, we are supposed to join all exons and introduce that into E. coli, which will be cloned and expressed. Okay, that we can't do, but cells can. So what we do is, these are the steps. What we do is, we maintain pancreatic beta cell culture. And beta cells are capable of converting insulin genes into functional mRNAs of insulin after splicing. So these functional mRNAs of insulin do not have introns. So we extract these functional mRNAs of insulin from pancreatic beta cells. We add these functional mRNAs into a tube. We use reverse transcriptase. We use what is transcription? Transcription is DNA to RNA. So what is reverse transcription? RNA to DNA is reverse transcription. So we use reverse transcriptase. We convert these functional mRNAs into double-stranded DNAs. Such double-stranded DNAs, which are complementary to fully spliced mRNAs, are called as cDNAs. So whenever you are questioned about cDNAs, it's not enough if you just say they are complementary DNAs. You should say what are they complementary to. You should say cDNAs are double-stranded DNAs which are complementary to fully spliced mRNA. Or in other words, cDNAs do not have introns. cDNAs do not have introns. And these cDNAs will then be introduced into E. coli, where it is cloned and expressed. Okay, so these are the steps involved in recombinant DNA technology related to insulin synthesis. So only for you to understand, I said you take insulin gene from human chromosome. We are not going to take insulin gene from human chromosome. From where do we get insulin gene? We maintain pancreatic beta cell culture. We extract functional mRNAs from beta cells. In a test tube, we convert those mRNAs to cDNAs. cDNAs are complementary DNAs without introns. those cDNAs are introduced into E. coli when it is cloned and expressed. Okay, so that's about cDNAs. Now finally, about applications of recombinant DNA technology. There are so many applications of recombinant DNA technology. Let me begin with a milder or a lighter application of recombinant DNA technology. It's in plants. Yeah, we always talk about GMO. Yeah, genetically modified organisms, genetically modified plants. We are always wary of those modifications. But I would say no, you don't have to worry much about it. I'll tell you why later on. So, recombinant DNA technology in plants. This technique utilizes an organism by name Agrobacterium tumefaciens. And Agrobacterium tumefaciens is an organism, it's a gram-negative bacillus, soil-dwelling bacteria, which is causative of crown gall disease. Yeah, it causes crown gall disease, and for our understanding, it is nothing but tumors in plants. So this organism is capable of causing tumors in plants, and later molecular biologists identified that the ability to cause tumor is attributed to TI plasmid. It is attributed to TI plasmid of this organism. TI means tumor inducing plasmid. And that tumor inducing plasmid has got a very short fragment which is called as tDNA, and only this tDNA has got genes which are capable of causing cancer. Okay, so they basically code for cytokines which cause transformation of plant cells into less differentiated, rapidly replicating cells. So what they thought is, why not we remove this tDNA, the dangerous tDNA, tumor causing DNA can be removed. Instead, it can be replaced with something which is beneficial, and that plasmid can be inserted into plant cell, and plant cell will be transformed with this gene of interest. So we will get a GMO product. Okay, so that's the basis of Agrobacterium tumefaciens. So as I said, it's a gram-negative rod. It causes tumor, and tumor causing property is attributed to this TI plasmid. And in TI plasmid, not every segment is dangerous. Only this lighter green is dangerous because it has got cytokine coding genes. So what they thought was, let's cut this, remove this, replace it with gene of interest. So you get a transformed cell, and this transformed cell can be used for regenerating a plant with beneficial qualities. So all these started with Bacillus thuringiensis toxin. So the first time when recombinant DNA technology was applied in plants, it was used for plants to be capable of producing a toxin called as Bacillus thuringiensis. And this Bacillus thuringiensis is a gram-positive soil-dwelling bacteria, and the toxin it produces is found to be toxic to insects. So this was once used as a biological insecticide. So later biologists thought, or botanists thought, why should we add it externally? Why not we introduce that genome into the plant and let the plant start producing toxin? Okay, so Bacillus thuringiensis toxin producing segment was inserted into the TI plasmid and was used for transforming plant cells. And of course, there are many controversies related to it. They say that this toxin is not only toxic to toxic insects, it's also toxic to butterfly. Yeah, so they say it causes colony shock syndrome. So there are many controversies related to it, but this was the first application. And then the well-known golden rice, yeah, gold rice. So what is this rice? This rice has vitamin A. How is it capable of producing vitamin A? It is because they have added 2 gene fragments from 2 organisms. One is daffodil. Daffodil gives phytoene synthase gene, and a soil bacterium provides phytoene reductase. So these gene fragments are clubbed together as one fragment, and it is introduced into the plant. So the plant produces rice which acts as a source of vitamin A. That's why it's called as golden rice. So that's the next example. And apart from this, we have many genetically modified plants. Example, soy. You know, soy has got a huge demand because of its high protein content. But the usual agriculture, they were not able to meet the demand. So, genetically modified soy increased productivity. Genetically modified eggplants had a huge size. So, all these are examples of recombinant DNA technology in plants. Now, what about in animals, in humans? First is the simplest application is they started producing chymosin on a large scale, and this chymosin helps in cheese production. And then the famous insulin synthesis, because we know porcine insulin and bovine insulin are immunogenic. And then growth hormone synthesis by recombinant DNA technology was also path-breaking, because growth hormone extracted from blood was found to cause Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome. So we thought we have to produce human growth hormone by recombinant DNA technology, and that was a huge success. And then alteplase, it's a recombinant DNA technology based synthesis of tissue plasminogen activator, which is used for thrombolysis, and it's used in acute MI and acute stroke. And finally, the recombinant subunit vaccine. This is something which is of importance these days during pandemic. So recombinant subunit vaccine. So if you ask me what is the recombinant subunit vaccine, the first step in synthesizing a recombinant subunit vaccine is identifying an antigen of the organism for which a human being is capable of producing a neutralizing antibody. So by tissue culture methods, out of all antigens that are present in a virus or in a bacteria, they identify to which antigen human cells are capable of producing neutralizing antibody. Why are we interested about neutralizing antibody? If your body produces a non-neutralizing antibody against any of the antigens of an organism, that non-neutralizing antibody can result in something called as antibody dependent enhancement. Please beware of this antibody dependent enhancement. For example, dengue. Till date we have not been able to find out or synthesize a vaccine against dengue virus, because till now culture studies have not identified a single antigen against which neutralizing antibody can be synthesized. Many non-neutralizing antibodies are getting synthesized. That is why when there is a cross infection with another serotype of dengue, the presentation will be severe. Do you understand this? So the first step is identifying the antigen against which neutralizing antibody is being synthesized by human cells. And once you have identified that antigen, what we are going to do is, by recombinant DNA technology, we are going to synthesize that antigen in excess, and we are going to introduce just that antigen into human being, and human body starts producing antibodies, and memory cells will not allow further entry of that antigen in the form of virus. Okay, so that's about recombinant subunit vaccine. And if you are asking me what are generally the other types of vaccine, as we all know, we have three types of vaccines. The first one is live attenuated vaccine. The second one is inactivated killed vaccine. And the third one is a subunit vaccine. Live attenuated vaccine has got one major advantage. It is highly immunogenic, because you are giving the whole live virus to a person which is attenuated. But what is a major disadvantage of using live attenuated vaccine? Safety is debatable if it's injected or given to an immunocompromised individual. Though it is attenuated, it can cause a full-blown infection in the case of an immunocompromised individual. That's about live attenuated vaccine. Inactivated or killed vaccine, it's safe. It's not going to cause full-blown infection, so it's safe in vivo. But the disadvantage is immunogenicity is less. And the other disadvantage is, though it is safe in vivo, what we do initially for all these viral vaccines, is we first allow the viruses to grow in culture and then we inactivate them. So until you inactivate them, there is always a possibility of the virus getting spread. Particularly if it's a dangerous virus like coronavirus, before inactivation, containment of such vaccines in culture is a difficult aspect. Okay, so all these difficulties can be overcome by subunit vaccine. Because subunit, you don't have to maintain a viral culture at all. So this subunit vaccine has a major advantage for those organisms in which case we can't maintain a culture. For example, hepatitis B viruses cannot be maintained in culture that easily. That is why for hepatitis B vaccine, we are using a subunit vaccine. So the major advantage of subunit vaccine is viruses need not be grown in culture, and then it's safe because it's just a subunit. It is not going to organize as a whole virus to cause a full-blown infection in anybody. So it is safe and it's immunogenic. We are giving only one subunit. How do you claim to to have good immunogenicity? It is because we add adjuvants to improve immunogenicity. Okay. So about subunit vaccines, as I said, HBV, hepatitis B vaccine is the first vaccine as far as subunit vaccine is concerned, and in this case we have added 226 amino acid fragment of hepatitis B surface antigen fragment is inserted into an expression vector and is grown in yeast. And these days multi-subunit coding gene fragments are getting added and inserted as expression vectors into yeast. They are grown. So they aggregate to form viral-like particles, and these are being tried for parvovirus and for some influenza viruses. And we are also trying it for coronavirus SARS-CoV-2, and that's called as Corbevax. And if you ask me about Corbevax, it is the technology was first developed by US Baylor College of Medicine, and the technology is now transferred to Biologicals E Limited, which is a Hyderabad based company. And here S protein is identified as an antigen against which neutralizing antibodies are getting synthesized, and that is getting attached to an expression vector, and it is introduced into yeast. And the yeast that is used for this purpose is Pichia pastoris. And interestingly, the phase 1 trial and phase 2 trials are over. Phase 1 and phase 2 trials got over with 360 participants, and DCGI recently approved for phase 3 trial. It got over with 1,268 participants. And the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare of India, we have procured or we have pre-ordered 300 million doses. And for Corbevax, we need 2 doses for every individual. So using this, we are trying to vaccinate 15 crore Indians. And it's expected anytime, because the third phase 3 trial is almost over. It's expected in market anytime. That's about Corbevax. It's a subunit vaccine. So what is the difference between this subunit vaccine Corbevax and the already in use viral vector vaccine including Covishield and Sputnik? The basic difference is, as I told you previously, in the case of subunit vaccine, there is ex vivo production of antigens, that is outside human body. In the tissue culture, we produce S protein, which is then used as an antigen within the human body. Whereas in the case of viral vector vaccine, we take the viral genome which codes for S protein, we pack it within the viral vector, we introduce the genome into the human body. Within human body, the genome produces antigens. So it is in vivo production. So the basic difference is, in subunit vaccine, it's ex vivo production of antigen, whereas in the case of Sputnik and Covishield, it is in vivo production of antigen. So here, for Covishield particularly, we are using as a viral vector a replication deficient chimpanzee adenovirus as a vector. So if you're asking me why are we very specific about replication deficient chimpanzee adenovirus Chadox, obviously because if it's capable of replication, when the genome carrying viral vector is introduced into human cell, if it's allowed to replicate, it might cause adenoviral infection. That is why we made it replication deficient. So how did we make it replication deficient? By splitting E1A and E1B genes. So E1A and E1B genes of adenovirus are responsible for replication. They are responsible for integration of their genome into any other genome. That is being cut, and that is why it is replication deficient. So that expression vector is packed with an adenovirus. And this is how the adenovirus looks. When this is injected into a human body, these adenoviruses go and get docked onto cell membrane through one of these vertices. Do you see that here? Through one of these vertices, adenovirus goes and docks with cell membrane, after which clathrin causes endocytosis of adenovirus. Now adenovirus is within the endocytotic vesicle, and slowly the endocytotic vesicle releases the viral particle, and viral particle goes and binds to nuclear membrane, following which the recombinant viral genome carrying the segment which codes for S protein is injected into the nucleus through nucleopore. And once it gets into the nucleus, this gene starts undergoing transcription to form mRNAs of S protein. These mRNAs come out of nucleus and they reach the cytoplasm. In cytoplasm, these mRNAs undergo translation to form a monomeric S protein, and these monomeric S proteins undergo polymerization to form trimeric S protein. And these trimeric S protein, as I said, have got tissue plasminogen activator leader sequence, and these leader sequences help in translocating these trimeric S protein to go and get adhered to the cell membrane. This is all that is needed for your immune response to be initiated. Once they find a viral antigen on surface of the cell, B cells will start binding to these antigens. Once B cells get activated, they become plasma cells. They start producing antibodies. On the other hand, these B cells, some of these B cells also become memory cells, and these memory cells will not abide further entry of S protein in any form. So this is how immunity is set up with the help of Covishield and Sputnik. So what is the difference between Covishield and Sputnik? Covishield is manufactured in India. Sputnik is a Russian vaccine. So the basic difference is, in the case of Covishield, for the first and the second dose, it's the same adenovirus that is used as a vector. In that case, antibodies can get generated against antigens of the first adenoviral vaccine, and those antibodies can act against the second dose that is given. So immunogenicity can be reduced, might be reduced. And that is why what Sputnik has done is, in the case of Sputnik, the first dose has got one adenovirus as a carrier, whereas the second dose uses another adenovirus as a carrier. So even if antibodies get generated following the first dose, it is not going to affect the adenovirus that carries the genome as the second dose. So probably Sputnik will have a higher immunogenicity. Now the most important question, will these viral vector based vaccine cause transformation of cells? Because we are introducing nucleic acids, and nucleic acids can get integrated into a genome by homologous recombination or by heterologous recombination. So do you think there is going to be a possibility of transformation of cells causing probably tumors, or as my uncle asked, will there be a disintegration of human genome so we start growing tails? Is that possible? It is not possible, because as I said, the adenoviral genome, which is responsible for replication, which is responsible for integration, is cut. It is no more intact. So even the minor possibility, the very minimal possibility of adenoviral genome getting integrated into human genome by E1A and E1B gene is shattered because it is cut. So it is not going to cause transformation of cells. Okay. So summary is, recombinant DNA technology is nothing but cell-based cloning, and for cell-based cloning we have few requirements like restriction endonucleases, we need hybridization technique or blotting technique, we also need vectors. And for recombinant DNA technology to be capable of producing proteins, these vectors should not be just vectors, they should be expression vectors. And the basic qualities of expression vectors are sequences responsible for transcription, sequences responsible for translation, sequences that make them soluble, sequences that increase immunogenicity. And thank you, because I have not spoken anything about transgenic animals. I thought I close the session with a picture of transgenic animal which is fluorescent. Yeah, see you soon.